A 17-year-old boy walked out of Jefferson High School on a crisp October afternoon in 1985 and vanished without a trace. 30 years later, a teacher cleaning out an old desk drawer discovered a hidden compartment containing letters that would unravel one of the most heartbreaking mysteries in the town's history and reveal the true meaning of sacrifice. The autumn leaves of 1985 were just beginning their brilliant transformation when Tommy Rodriguez stepped through the heavy glass doors of Jefferson High School for what would be the last time. The red brick building stood like a fortress against the gray October sky, its windows reflecting the fading sunlight as students poured out into the crisp afternoon air. Tommy adjusted his worn denim jacket, the same one he'd inherited from his older brother Miguel, who had graduated 3 years earlier, and checked his watch. 3:15 on the dot. Most students rushed toward the parking lot where yellow buses idled in neat rows, their diesel engines rumbling like sleeping giants. Others headed toward the athletic fields where the sounds of after-school practices were already beginning to echo across the campus. But Tommy walked with deliberate purpose toward the bike racks near the school's east entrance, his heavy backpack slung over one shoulder, his chemistry textbook clutched in his free hand. He'd promised his mother, Elena Rodriguez, that he'd be home by 4 o'clock to help with his younger sister Carmen's homework before heading to his part-time job at Morrison's hardware store. The family needed every dollar he could earn, especially since his father had been laid off from the steel mill 6 months earlier. At 17, Tommy had become the family's primary breadwinner, a responsibility that weighed heavily on his young shoulders, but one he carried with quiet dignity. The bike racks were nearly empty by the time Tommy reached them, most students having already retrieved their rides and headed home. His bicycle, a faded blue Schwinn that had seen better days, was chained to the far end of the rack where he always left it. The bike had been a gift from his Uncle Carlos 3 Christmases ago, and though the paint was chipped and the gears occasionally stuck, it was Tommy's most prized possession and his reliable transportation to school and work. As he fumbled with the combination lock, Tommy noticed Mrs. Henderson, his English teacher, walking toward her car in the faculty parking lot. She waved at him, and he raised his hand in response, offering the same shy smile that had endeared him to teachers and classmates alike. Mrs. Henderson would later tell investigators that Tommy had seemed perfectly normal that afternoon, perhaps a bit tired from working late at the hardware store the night before, but showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. Tommy finally freed his bike from the rack and swung his leg over the seat, settling his backpack more securely on his shoulders. The ride home would take him through the quiet residential streets of Millbrook, past the elementary school where Carmen was probably just finishing her after-school program, and through the small commercial district where his mother worked as a seamstress at Martinez Alterations. He pedaled slowly at first, in no particular hurry despite his promise to be home on time. The October air was crisp but not yet cold, perfect weather for cycling, and Tommy found himself taking the longer route home through Riverside Park. The park was one of his favorite places in the entire town, a green oasis where he often came. To think when the pressures of school, work, and family responsibilities became overwhelming. The park's main path wound along the banks of Miller Creek, a narrow waterway that had once powered the town's original grain mill in the 1800s. Ancient oak trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the asphalt below. Tommy had discovered this route during his freshman year and had been taking it regularly ever since, especially when he needed time to clear his head. As he rode deeper into the park, Tommy passed the old stone bridge that crossed Miller Creek, at its widest point. The bridge was a local landmark, built in 1923 according to the brass plaque mounted on its side, and it offered a perfect view of the creek as it meandered through the park toward the river beyond. Tommy often stopped here to watch the water flow over the smooth stones below, finding something peaceful in its constant, gentle movement. But on this particular afternoon, Tommy didn't stop at the bridge. Security cameras from the park's maintenance building would later show him cycling past at approximately 3:45. his familiar figure clearly visible as he navigated the curved path with practiced ease. He appeared calm and unhurried, occasionally standing on his pedals to gain momentum on the slight uphill sections of the path. What the cameras couldn't capture was the letter folded carefully in Tommy's jacket pocket, a letter he'd written the night before, but hadn't yet decided whether to send. The letter was addressed to his father, Hector Rodriguez, and contained words that Tommy had been struggling to find for months. In it, he'd tried to explain his decision, his reasoning, his hopes for his family's future. But the letter remained, unsent, tucked away like so many of his private thoughts and fears. Tommy's route through the park would normally take him out through the north entrance onto Elm Street, from which it was just a short ride to his family's modest two-story house. On Maple Avenue, the house was small but well-maintained, with a tiny front yard that Elena kept filled with flowers during the warmer months and a detached garage where Hector spent his time tinkering with small engines and dreaming of better days. The Rodriguez family had lived in that house for 8 years, ever since moving to Millbrook from El Paso when Tommy was 9 years old. Hector had found work at the steel mill. Elena had established herself as one of the town's most skilled seamstresses, and Tommy had quickly adapted to his new school and made friends with an ease that surprised his parents. Carmen had been born 2 years after their arrival, making her truly a child of Millbrook in a way that the rest of the family would never quite be. By 4 o'clock, when Tommy failed to arrive home as promised, Elena began to worry. It wasn't like her eldest son to be late without calling, especially when he knew Carmen was counting on his help with her mathematics homework. She called Morrison's hardware store to see if perhaps Tommy had gone directly to work, but Mr. Morrison told her that Tommy wasn't scheduled until 5:30 and hadn't arrived early. Elena walked to the front window and peered down Maple Avenue, hoping to see Tommy's familiar figure pedaling toward home. The street was quiet in the way that residential neighborhoods always are in the late afternoon, with most adults still at work and children either inside doing homework or playing in their backyards. A few cars passed by, their occupants probably, heading home from errands or picking up their own children from various activities. When 4:15 came and went with no sign of Tommy, Elena called Jefferson High School. The secretary who answered was helpful, but couldn't provide much information beyond confirming that Tommy had attended all his classes that day and had been seen leaving the building at the normal time. She suggested that Elena call some of Tommy's friends to see if perhaps he'd stopped somewhere on his way home. But Tommy's closest friends hadn't seen him since the final bell rang at 3:10. Marcus Williams, who sat next to Tommy in chemistry class, said Tommy had seemed quiet during their last period, but otherwise normal. Sarah Chen, who worked with Tommy on the school newspaper, mentioned that he'd turned in his article about the upcoming homecoming dance right on schedule. Nobody had any idea where Tommy might have gone, or why he hadn't come home. As the minutes turned into an hour, Elena's worry deepened into genuine fear. Hector, who had been out looking for work, returned home to find his wife pacing the kitchen, while Carmen sat at the dining room table, her mathematics homework forgotten, as she watched her mother with wide, frightened eyes. When Elena explained the situation, Hector immediately got back in his car and began driving Tommy's usual routes between school and home, checking every street and alley where his son might have stopped or encountered trouble. By 6 o'clock, with Tommy now 3 hours overdue and having missed his shift at the hardware store, the Rodriguez family made the decision that would mark the beginning of their long nightmare. Elena called the Millbrook Police Department to report her son missing. The desk sergeant who took the call was sympathetic, but explained that teenage boys sometimes disappeared for a few hours without telling their parents, usually turning up by bedtime with explanations involving friends, girlfriends, or simple forgetfulness about time. But Elena knew her son better than that. Tommy was responsible beyond his years, keenly aware of his family's dependence on his income and his role as Carmen's homework helper and occasional babysitter. He would never simply disappear without explanation, especially not when he knew his absence would cause worry and financial hardship. Something was wrong, she insisted to the police officer. Something was terribly wrong. The initial police response was routine, but thorough. Officers drove the route between Jefferson High School and the Rodriguez home, checking with business owners and residents along the way to see if anyone had noticed Tommy or his bicycle. They interviewed his teachers, his friends, his co-workers at the hardware store, and his family members, looking for any clue that might explain his sudden disappearance. What they found was a portrait of a young man who seemed incapable of simply vanishing by choice. Tommy was an honor student, well-liked by teachers and peers alike. He was dependable at work, often staying late when needed, and never missing a shift without calling ahead. He was devoted to his family, particularly his younger sister, and had never shown any signs of wanting to run away or escape his responsibilities. Yet as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, Tommy Rodriguez remained missing. His bicycle was never found. There were no witnesses to whatever had happened to him after he left the park. No ransom demands, no mysterious phone calls, no letters or messages of any kind. He had simply vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all, leaving behind only questions, grief, and a family that would never be the same. The Rodriguez family home on Maple Avenue had aged in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time. 30 years after Tommy's disappearance, the small two-story house bore the weight of decades spent waiting for answers that never came. The white paint had faded to a dull cream, the front porch sagged slightly on one side, and the flower garden that Elena had once tended with such care had given way to practical shrubs that required little maintenance. Carmen Rodriguez Chen stood in the driveway, keys in hand, staring at the house where she'd grown up in the shadow of her missing brother. Now 45 years old, she was a successful accountant with her own firm in the next town over, married to David Chen for 18 years, and the mother of 2 teenage daughters who had never met their Uncle Tommy but knew his story by heart. Carmen visited her parents every Sunday without fail, a ritual that had become both comfort and burden over the decades. The garage door creaked as it opened, revealing Hector Rodriguez bent over the engine of a 1987 Chevrolet pickup truck. At 73, he was thinner than he'd been in his steel mill days, his thick black hair now completely silver, but his hands remained steady as he worked. Retirement had come early and unwillingly when the mill finally closed permanently, in 1998, but Hector had found purpose in his small engine repair business, operated out of the garage that had once housed dreams of prosperity. "Papa," Carmen called softly, not wanting to startle him. Hector looked up, his weathered face breaking, into the gentle smile he reserved for his daughter. Despite everything they'd endured as a family, despite the hole that Tommy's absence had torn in their lives, Hector had never lost his capacity for joy in Carmen's presence. She was his miracle, the child who had kept them anchored when grief threatened to sweep them away entirely. "Mija," he said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Your mother is inside, making enough food for an army again. I keep telling her you have your own family to feed, but she insists you're too skinny." This was their routine, the comfortable small talk that helped bridge the gap between ordinary life and the extraordinary weight of their shared loss. Elena Rodriguez appeared in the doorway connecting the garage to the kitchen, wearing the same style of apron she'd favored for decades, though her figure was rounder now and her dark hair was streaked with gray. At 70, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her eyes remained sharp and alert, always watching, always hoping for some sign of the son she'd never stopped expecting to walk through the front door. "Carmen, perfect timing," Elena said, embracing her daughter with the fierce intensity she'd developed over the years, as if every hug might be the last. "I made your favorite enchiladas, and there's flan for dessert. Are David and the girls coming for dinner?" Carmen shook her head, apologetically. "Soccer practice for both girls today, and David's working on a big case. It's just me this week." She'd learned not to make excuses for her family's absence, understanding that her parents needed these Sunday visits more than they would ever admit. David was patient with her devotion to her parents, and the girls had grown up understanding that Sundays belonged to Abuela and Abuelo Rodriguez. The kitchen table was set for 4 places, as it had been every Sunday for the past 30 years. The 4th place setting had been Elena's idea initially, a way of keeping Tommy present in their weekly gatherings, but over time it had become less about hope and more about honor, a simple acknowledgement that someone was missing from their circle. None of them spoke about the empty chair anymore. It was simply part of the landscape of their grief. As they sat down to eat, Carmen studied her parents with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades watching for signs of decline or despair. Hector seemed strong, his appetite good. His conversation animated as he described the antique motorcycle he was restoring for a customer. Elena was more subdued, but that was normal for her. She'd never fully recovered from the initial shock of Tommy's disappearance and had developed a quiet, watchful quality that made her seem perpetually braced for bad news. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by yesterday," Elena mentioned casually as she served the enchiladas. "She wanted to know if we'd heard anything new about Tommy." Mrs. Patterson was their next-door neighbor, a widow in her 80s who had lived on Maple Avenue longer than anyone and remembered when the Rodriguez family had first moved in. She'd been one of the volunteers who had helped search for Tommy in those first desperate weeks, and she'd never stopped caring about the outcome. Carmen felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied discussions of Tommy's case. "What did you tell her?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. There was never anything new to report, never any developments or breakthroughs, just the same empty silence that had persisted for 3 decades. "The same thing we always tell people," Hector replied with a slight shrug. "That we're still waiting, still hoping, still praying that someday we'll know what happened to our boy." His voice carried the weight of countless repetitions of this same conversation with neighbors, friends, relatives, and the occasional journalist who still found their story compelling enough to revisit. The truth was that the Rodriguez family had long ago stopped expecting resolution. The police investigation had gone cold within the first year, despite the dedication of Detective Sarah Morrison, who had worked the case tirelessly until her retirement in 2005. The FBI had been brought in during the 2nd year, but their resources were eventually redirected to more recent cases with better prospects for resolution. Private investigators had been hired and dismissed when the family's savings ran out, and no significant leads emerged. Carmen had grown up in a house where conversations stopped when she entered the room, where her parents spoke in hushed tones about search parties and reward funds and the possibility that Tommy had been murdered or kidnapped, or had suffered some accident that left his body undiscovered. She'd learned to read the signs of her parents' hope and despair, the way Elena's shoulders would droop when another supposed sighting turned out to be nothing, the way Hector would disappear into his garage for hours when the anniversary of Tommy's disappearance approached each October. Her own relationship with Tommy's memory was complicated by the fact that she'd been only 15 when he vanished. Her memories of him were filtered through the lens of a younger sister's adoration, colored by 30 years of idealization and grief. She remembered him as patient and kind, always willing to help with her homework or explain a difficult concept. She remembered his laugh, his terrible jokes, the way he'd ruffle her hair when he passed by her chair at the breakfast table. But she also remembered the tension in the house during Tommy's final months, the whispered conversations between her parents about money and the future, the way Tommy had seemed to carry the weight of adult concerns on his 17-year-old shoulders. She'd been too young to fully understand the financial pressures that had fallen on Tommy after Hector's layoff, but she'd sensed the change in her brother's demeanor, the way he'd become more serious and withdrawn as the months passed. After dinner, Carmen helped her mother clean up while Hector returned to his work in the garage. This was their pattern, these comfortable domestic rituals that provided structure and normalcy to their Sundays together. Elena moved efficiently through the familiar tasks of washing dishes and storing leftovers, her movements economical and practiced after decades in the same kitchen. "How are the girls doing in school?" Elena asked, her standard question about her granddaughters. Carmen launched into updates about soccer tournaments and honor roll certificates and college preparation, safe topics that kept the conversation in the present rather than drifting toward the past. Elena listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions and offering grandmotherly advice about teenage concerns. But even in these ordinary moments, Tommy's absence was felt. Elena would occasionally pause in her work, her gaze drifting toward the window that looked out on Maple Avenue, as if she were still watching for a familiar figure on a blue bicycle. Carmen would catch these moments and feel her heart break a little, seeing how her mother's hope had never entirely died despite 3 decades of disappointment. The living room where they settled after cleaning up was a museum of sorts, filled with photographs that chronicled the Rodriguez family's life in Millbrook. There were pictures of Tommy at various ages, school portraits and candid shots from family gatherings. But there were also photos of Carmen's wedding, of her daughters as babies and toddlers and teenagers, of Hector and Elena at their silver wedding anniversary. The family had continued to create memories and celebrate milestones, even with one member forever absent. Carmen's daughters, Sophia and Isabella, appeared in many of the more recent photographs. At 16 and 14, they were close to the ages Tommy and Carmen had been when he disappeared, a parallel that was never explicitly discussed, but was felt by all 3 adults in the room. Sophia was particularly fascinated by her uncle's story, asking questions that her parents couldn't answer, and maintaining a teenage certainty that she could somehow solve the mystery that had baffled police and investigators for 30 years. Isabella won her debate tournament last week, Carmen reported, settling into the same chair she'd occupied during Sunday visits for years. She's thinking about majoring in criminal justice when she goes to college. This was new information, and Carmen watched her parents' reactions carefully. Both Sophia and Isabella had shown interest in law enforcement careers, drawn perhaps by their family's unsolved mystery. But Carmen worried about encouraging them to pursue fields that might bring them face to face with their own unresolved trauma. Elena's expression was complicated, pride mixing with concern. "That's wonderful, Mija. She's always been so smart, so determined. But I hope she's choosing it for the right reasons." Elena never said directly that she worried about her granddaughters being motivated by Tommy's case, but the implication was clear in her tone, and the way she glanced toward the mantelpiece where Tommy's high school graduation photo held a place of honor. As the afternoon wore on, Carmen found herself studying the familiar surroundings with fresh eyes, trying to imagine what it would be like for an outsider to enter this space. Would they immediately sense the weight of loss that permeated every corner? Or would they see simply a comfortable family home filled with evidence of love and continuity? The house was clean and well-maintained, decorated with Elena's careful attention to detail, but there was something indefinably sad about it, as if the very walls were holding their breath. When it came time to leave, Carmen went through the ritual of embracing her parents and promising to call during the week. Hector walked her to her car, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he'd done since she was a child. Elena stood in the doorway, waving until Carmen's car disappeared around the corner. Another Sunday concluded in the endless series of Sundays they'd shared since Tommy's disappearance. As Carmen drove home to her own family, she reflected on the strange duality of her life. During the week, she was a successful professional, a devoted wife and mother, a woman who had built a good life despite the tragedy that had shaped her childhood. But on Sundays, she returned to being the sister of a missing boy, part of a family, frozen in time, still waiting for answers that might never come. She'd learned to compartmentalize these 2 versions of herself, but the transition between them never became easier, no matter how many years passed. Margaret Walsh had taught English at Jefferson High School for 43 years, and she'd planned to make it an even 45 before retiring. At 67, she still possessed the energy and passion that had made her one of the school's most beloved educators. Though her auburn hair had turned silver and reading glasses now hung perpetually from a chain around her neck. She'd taught 3 generations of some families, watched the school undergo countless renovations and administrative changes, and accumulated enough stories to fill several books about the evolution of American teenagers from the 1970s through the present day. The classroom that had been her domain for over 4 decades was located on the 2nd floor of Jefferson High's original building, overlooking the courtyard where students gathered between classes and during lunch breaks. Room 237 had high ceilings, tall windows that let in generous amounts of natural light, and built-in wooden cabinets that dated back to the school's construction in 1923. Margaret had spent thousands of hours in this space, teaching everything, from basic grammar to advanced placement literature, guiding students through the complexities of Shakespeare and the nuances of contemporary poetry. On this particular Tuesday morning in October 2015, exactly 30 years after Tommy Rodriguez had disappeared, Margaret was engaged in the melancholy task of packing up her classroom. The decision to retire had come suddenly, prompted by her husband's diagnosis with early-stage Alzheimer's disease and her desire to spend his remaining good years traveling and creating memories together. The school district had been understanding, allowing her to finish the semester and providing a generous retirement package that reflected her decades of dedicated service. The process of dismantling a career's worth of accumulated materials was both overwhelming and oddly therapeutic. Margaret had always been a pack rat when it came to teaching supplies, unable to throw away anything that might someday prove useful in a lesson plan. Over the years, she'd collected boxes of books, filing cabinets full of handouts and assignments, drawers packed with pens and markers and supplies donated by grateful parents. Now she was forced to make decisions about what to keep, what to donate, and what to finally discard after years of faithful service. Her student teacher, Jessica Martinez, a 23-year-old graduate student from the local university, was helping with the packing process. Jessica was enthusiastic and hardworking, eager to absorb every piece of wisdom Margaret was willing to share about the art and science of teaching. She'd been assigned to Margaret's classroom for her final semester of student teaching, and the 2 women had developed a mentoring relationship that extended beyond the formal requirements of the program. "Mrs. Walsh, what should I do with all these old grade books?" Jessica asked, holding up a stack of leather-bound record books that dated back to the 1980s. The grade books were relics from an earlier era, before computer-based record-keeping had revolutionized the way teachers tracked student progress. Each book contained handwritten records of assignments, test scores, and attendance for entire semesters, representing hundreds of students who had passed through Margaret's classroom over the decades. Margaret paused in her own sorting to examine the grade books Jessica was holding. "Those should probably go to the district archives," she said thoughtfully. "They might be useful for researchers studying educational trends, or for alumni who want to verify their academic records for some reason. Though I can't imagine anyone actually needing a record of their sophomore English grade from 1987. As Jessica carried the gradebooks to a designated archive box, Margaret turned her attention to the large wooden desk that had been her command center for most of her career. The desk was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, built during the school's original construction and featuring multiple drawers, compartments, and hidden storage areas that she'd discovered gradually over the years. She'd always joked that the desk had more secrets than a teenager's diary, and she'd made full use of every nook and cranny for storing supplies, personal items, and the occasional confiscated note or toy. The top drawers yielded the expected collection of pens, pencils, paper clips, and rubber bands, along with several packages of throat lozenges and a small bottle of aspirin that had seen frequent use during particularly challenging days. The deeper drawers contained files of lesson plans organized by year and unit, some dating back to her first years of teaching when she'd written everything out in careful longhand before the advent of word processors and computers. But it was the bottom drawer on the right side of the desk that presented the most interesting challenge. Margaret had always known this drawer was deeper than it appeared from the outside, but she'd never bothered to investigate why. Over the years, she'd used it primarily for storing supplies that were used infrequently: boxes of overhead transparencies, outdated textbooks that were too damaged to use but too nostalgic to throw away, and various educational materials that had fallen out of favor as teaching methods evolved. As Margaret began removing items from this drawer, she noticed that it seemed to extend further back into the desk than the space should have allowed. Curious, she got down on her hands and knees and peered into the empty drawer with the help of her phone's flashlight. What she saw made her pause in confusion and then excitement. There appeared to be a false back to the drawer, creating a hidden compartment that she'd never discovered in all her years of using the desk. "Jessica, come look at this," Margaret called, her voice tinged with the thrill of discovery. Jessica hurried over and crouched down beside her mentor, following Margaret's pointing finger into the depths of the drawer. Together, they could see that the wooden back panel was slightly loose, as if it had been designed to be removable but had been painted over so many times that it had become sealed in place. Margaret retrieved a letter opener from one of the other drawers and carefully worked it around the edges of the false back, trying to loosen the paint and grime that had accumulated over decades. The wood was old but solid, and it took several minutes of patient work before they were able to pry the panel free. When it finally came loose, it revealed a narrow compartment about 8 inches deep, 4 inches wide, and 12 inches long. Inside, the hidden compartment, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were several items that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. There was a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon, a small notebook with a worn leather cover, and what appeared to be military documents and photographs. The items had clearly been hidden intentionally, placed carefully in the compartment by someone who wanted to ensure they wouldn't be discovered accidentally. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the bundle from its hiding place, sensing immediately that she was holding something significant. The oiled cloth was old, but had done its job well, protecting the contents from moisture and decay. As she unwrapped the items on top of her desk, Jessica standing beside her with wide eyes, Margaret felt like an archaeologist uncovering artifacts from a lost civilization. The letters were written in a neat, careful hand on lined paper that had yellowed with age. The return address on several of the envelopes read, Private Thomas Rodriguez, U.S. Army, with various military postal codes and dates from the mid-1980s. Margaret's heart began to race as she recognized the surname Rodriguez and remembered the family tragedy that had shaken the entire community 30 years earlier. "Tommy Rodriguez," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "Jessica, I think we've found something that belonged to Tommy Rodriguez." Jessica's expression shifted from curiosity to amazement as she made the connection. Even 30 years later, everyone in Millbrook knew the story of the teenager who had vanished without a trace, and younger residents like Jessica had grown up hearing the tale as a cautionary story about the dangers that could befall even the most responsible young people. Margaret carefully opened the first letter, her hands shaking with the weight of what she might discover. The letter was dated September 15, 1985, just a few weeks before Tommy's disappearance, and was addressed to My Dearest Family. The handwriting was clear and steady, but the content was heartbreaking in its maturity and selflessness. I know, this letter will come as a shock to all of you, and I pray that by the time you read it, you'll understand why I had to make the choice I made. The recruiter, Sergeant Mitchell, explained everything to me about the delayed entry program and how it works. I've enlisted in the Army, and my ship date is October 30th. I'll be going to basic training at Fort Benning and then on to advanced training for military police. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading. The letter explained Tommy's reasoning in careful, thoughtful language that revealed a young man grappling with impossible circumstances. He wrote about the family's financial struggles, about his father's unemployment, and the mounting bills that threatened to force them from their home. He described his research into military benefits, how the signing bonus and steady pay would provide immediate relief for his family, and how the GI Bill would eventually allow him to attend college without burdening his parents with additional debt. I know Mama will be angry and scared, and Papa will feel like I'm questioning his ability to provide for us, the letter continued. But this isn't about what anyone has or hasn't done. This is about what I can do, what I want to do, to make sure Carmen can go to college and you and Papa can keep the house and maybe even take a real vacation someday. I'm 17, but I'll be 18 before I ship out, so legally I can make this decision for myself. Jessica was reading over Margaret's shoulder, tears streaming down her own face as the full implication of the letter became clear. Tommy Rodriguez hadn't vanished mysteriously or been the victim of foul play. He had made a calculated decision to enlist in the military without telling his family, planning to surprise them with the news and the financial relief his service would provide. But something had gone wrong. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Tommy's disappearance, and it was still hidden in the desk, never delivered to his family. Whatever had happened to prevent Tommy from returning home that October afternoon had also prevented his family from ever learning about his plans, his motivations, and his deep love for them. Margaret continued reading through the other letters, each one revealing more about Tommy's state of mind in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He wrote about meeting with the recruiter multiple times, about taking the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery and scoring high enough to qualify for military police training. He described his excitement about the opportunities the military would provide, but also his anxiety about telling his family and his fear that they would try to talk him out of his decision. The notebook contained even more detailed information about Tommy's research and planning. He'd written down information about military pay scales, benefits packages, and education opportunities. He'd calculated exactly how much money he would be able to send home each month and how long it would take to pay off the family's debts. He'd even researched base locations and tried to request assignments that would keep him relatively close to home, at least during his initial enlistment period. The military documents included his enlistment contract, signed and notarized, along with his delayed entry program paperwork and instructions for reporting to the military entrance processing station. Everything was official and legitimate, proving that Tommy had indeed enlisted and was scheduled to begin basic training on October 30th, 1985, just 2 weeks after he disappeared. The photographs showed Tommy in civilian clothes at what appeared to be the recruitment office, shaking hands with a uniformed sergeant and standing proudly next to American flags and military posters. In every picture, he looked older than his 17 years, his expression serious and determined. These weren't the photos of a confused or troubled teenager making an impulsive decision. They were the images of a young man who had carefully considered his options and chosen a path he believed would benefit his family. Margaret sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. In her hands were the answers to questions that had haunted the Rodriguez family and the entire community for 3 decades. Tommy hadn't run away or been kidnapped or murdered. He had enlisted in the army with the noble intention of providing for his family, but something had prevented him from explaining his decision or reporting for duty as scheduled. "We have to call the police," Jessica said, her voice filled with urgency and excitement. "We have to tell his family. Oh my God, Mrs. Walsh, his parents have spent 30 years thinking their son abandoned them or was killed by some stranger. They need to know the truth." Margaret nodded, her mind racing with the implications of their discovery. The letters and documents would reopen Tommy's case and potentially provide new leads for investigators to follow. But more importantly, they would give the Rodriguez family the knowledge that their son had loved them enough to sacrifice his own desires for their welfare, that his disappearance had not been a rejection or abandonment, but the tragic interruption of a selfless plan. As Margaret reached for her phone to call the authorities, she couldn't help but wonder about the circumstances that had led to these precious documents being hidden in her desk. Had Tommy placed them there himself, intending to retrieve them later? Had someone else discovered them and hidden them for reasons that might become clear as the investigation reopened? The answers to these questions might never be known, But the letters themselves were proof that sometimes the most important discoveries come when we least expect them, hidden in the ordinary places where we've worked and lived for years without realizing what secrets they contain. The Rodriguez family living room fell into the kind of silence that follows a lightning strike, heavy with the electricity of shock and the rumble of approaching change. Detective Maria Santos sat across from Elena and Hector Rodriguez, her official, folder containing photocopies of Tommy's letters resting on the coffee table between them like an unexploded bomb. Carmen had arrived 20 minutes earlier, her face pale with disbelief, while her daughters Sophia and Isabella flanked their grandparents on the worn sofa, their teenage faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. Elena's weathered hands clutched a tissue that had been reduced to shreds during Detective Santos's careful explanation of Margaret Walsh's discovery. For 30 years, she had imagined every possible scenario for her son's disappearance, from kidnapping to murder to voluntary flight. But never had she conceived that Tommy might have been planning to join the military. The revelation struck at the very foundation of everything she thought she knew about her eldest child and the circumstances surrounding his vanishing. "You're telling us that Tommy enlisted in the army?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, each word seeming to require tremendous effort. "That he was going to leave us anyway, even if nothing had happened to him." The pain in her question was palpable, carrying 3 decades of guilt and self-recrimination that had convinced her she had somehow failed as a mother, that Tommy's disappearance was punishment for her inadequacies. Detective Santos, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who had reopened the Rodriguez case after receiving Margaret Walsh's call, chose her words carefully. "Mrs. Rodriguez, based on these letters, your son wasn't leaving you. He was trying to save you. Every word he wrote shows how much he loved this family and how worried he was about your financial situation. He saw military service as a way to provide for you, not as an escape from you." Hector had remained silent throughout most of the detective's presentation, his jaw clenched with the particular kind of masculine pain that comes from learning that his teenage son had felt responsible for problems that should have been an adult's burden. Now he spoke for the first time since the detective's arrival, his voice rough with emotion. He was 17 years old. 17. He should have been worried about homework and girls and what college he wanted to attend, not about paying our bills or keeping us from losing the house. Carmen reached over to squeeze her father's shoulder, her own eyes bright with tears. "Papa, you couldn't have known. None of us knew what he was thinking. He kept it all to himself because he was trying to protect us just like he always did." She turned to Detective Santos, her voice taking on the crisp professional tone she used when discussing complex financial matters with her clients. "What exactly do the letters tell us about the timeline? When was he supposed to report for duty?" Detective Santos consulted her notes, though she had already memorized the crucial details. According to his enlistment papers, Tommy was scheduled to report to the Military Entrance Processing Station on October 30th, 1985, for transportation to Fort Benning. He disappeared on October 15th, which means he had exactly 2 weeks remaining before he was supposed to begin basic training. Isabella, the younger of Carmen's daughters, spoke up with the directness that only teenagers possess. "But if he was planning to tell you about enlisting, why didn't he? Why hide the letters in a desk at school instead of bringing them home?" Her question pierced straight to the heart of the mystery that now surrounded Tommy's disappearance, adding new layers of complexity rather than providing the closure everyone had hoped for. "That's what we need to figure out," Detective Santos replied. "The letters suggest he was struggling with how and when to tell you about his decision. He wrote about being afraid of your reactions, about worrying that you'd try to talk him out of enlisting. It's possible he was waiting for the right moment, or maybe he was planning to tell you just before his departure date." Sophia, who had inherited her uncle's serious nature despite never having met him, leaned forward with intense focus. "What happened when he didn't show up for basic training? Didn't the Army try to find him? Don't they have procedures for people who don't report as scheduled?" Her questions revealed the logical mind that had made her an excellent student and a natural problem solver, traits that reminded everyone in the room of the stories they'd heard about Tommy's academic abilities. "That's an excellent question," Detective Santos acknowledged. "I've already contacted the Department of Defense to request Tommy's military records. When someone fails to report for basic training, they're initially classified as a deserter, but there are follow-up procedures that should have been implemented. We'll need to find out exactly what steps were taken in 1985 and whether anyone from the military ever tried to contact your family." Elena's face crumpled as the full implications of this revelation settled over her. "All these years, I thought maybe he ran away because I was too strict, or because I put too much pressure on him to help with Carmen's homework, or because he was tired of wearing hand-me-down clothes and eating beans and rice for dinner 3 nights a week. I blamed myself for not seeing that he was unhappy, for not being a better mother." "Mama, no," Carmen said firmly, moving to sit beside her mother and taking her hands. "These letters prove exactly the opposite. They prove that Tommy loved you so much he was willing to sacrifice his own plans and dreams to take care of the family. You didn't fail him. You raised a son who was so devoted to his family that he was willing to join the military to support them financially." But Hector's reaction was moving in a different direction, his shock giving way to an anger that had been building for 30 years. "If he loved us so much, why didn't he trust us enough to tell us what he was planning? Why did he think he had to carry the weight of our problems on his shoulders? We were the adults. It was our job to figure out how to pay the bills and keep the house." Detective Santos had seen this pattern before in cold cases that suddenly broke open with new information. Families who had spent years united in their grief and confusion often found themselves fractured when new facts emerged, each member processing the revelations differently and at their own pace. "Mr. Rodriguez, 17-year-old boys don't always make decisions the way adults would." Tommy was trying to be the man of the house in his own mind, especially after you lost your job at the steel mill. From his perspective, he was old enough to enlist and mature enough to contribute to the family's welfare. "But he wasn't old enough," Elena protested, her voice rising with a desperation that had been building throughout the conversation. "He was still my baby, still in high school, still asking me to pack his lunch every morning and remind him to take his jacket when it was cold. How could the Army let a child make such a decision without his parents' permission?" Carmen looked up from the letters she'd been reading, her face grave. "Mama, the law allows 17-year-olds to enlist with parental consent, but Tommy would have turned 18 before his report date. Once he was 18, he could have enlisted without anyone's permission. The timing suggests he planned it that way deliberately." The room fell silent again as each family member absorbed this new layer of Tommy's planning and forethought. The Saib image of their lost son and brother was shifting from that of an impulsive teenager who had vanished mysteriously to that of a young man who had made careful, calculated decisions about his future and his family's welfare. It was simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring, proof of Tommy's maturity and love, while also highlighting the tragic circumstances that had led him to feel such responsibility at such a young age. Detective Santos gave them time to process before continuing. "There's something else we need to discuss. The fact that these letters were hidden in a desk at Jefferson High School raises questions about Tommy's activities on the day he disappeared. We know he left school at the normal time and was seen cycling through Riverside Park, but we don't know if he returned to the school later that day or if someone else placed the letters in that desk." Isabella straightened up, her investigative instincts activated by the detective's words. "Wait, so you're saying Uncle Tommy might have gone back to school that afternoon? That maybe he was planning to get the letters and bring them home, but something happened before he could?" "It's one possibility," Detective Santos confirmed. "Another possibility is that Tommy gave the letters to someone else for safekeeping, and that person hid them in the desk. We're going to need to re-interview everyone who was at the school that day, particularly teachers and staff who might have stayed late." Hector stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over Maple Avenue. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and when he spoke, His voice carried the weight of 30 years of unanswered questions. "So we still don't know what happened to him. We know he enlisted, we know he planned to tell us eventually, but we still don't know why he never came home that day, or where he's been all these years." "That's true," Detective Santos admitted. "But these letters give us new avenues to investigate. We can trace Tommy's interactions with his military recruiter, examine his activities in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, and look into whether anyone else knew about his enlistment plans. Sometimes cold cases break open, not because of one dramatic revelation, but because new information provides a different perspective on old evidence." Carmen looked around the room at her family, seeing the exhaustion and emotional turmoil written on every face. Her parents looked older than they had just 2 hours earlier, aged by the burden of processing information that fundamentally altered their understanding of their son's disappearance. Her daughters were struggling to reconcile their romanticized image of their missing uncle with the complex reality of a teenager making adult decisions under pressure. "What do we do now?" Carmen asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of emotional chaos. "How do we move forward with this information? Do we tell people? Do we hold a press conference? Do we start our own investigation?" Detective Santos gathered her files and prepared to leave, understanding that the family needed time alone to process what they'd learned. "For now, I'd recommend keeping this information within the family while we conduct our investigation. We don't want to compromise any potential leads by having details leaked to the media prematurely. I'll be in touch within the next few days with updates on what we learn from the military records and from re-interviewing people who were at the school in 1985. As the detective prepared to leave, Elena stood up on unsteady legs, her voice breaking, as she spoke. "Detective Santos, do you think Tommy is still alive? Do you think there's a chance we might see him again after all these years?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying the weight of 30 years of hope and heartbreak. Detective Santos paused at the door, her expression compassionate, but realistic. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I wish I could give you a definitive answer. What I can tell you is that these letters prove Tommy loved you deeply and was planning for a future that included taking care of his family. That gives me hope that wherever he is, whatever happened to him, he would want you to know the truth about his intentions." After the detective left, the Rodriguez family sat in their living room surrounded by the debris of their shattered assumptions, each lost in their own thoughts about what Tommy's letters meant for their understanding of the past and their hopes for the future. The truth they had longed for had finally arrived, but it brought with it new questions, new pain, and new possibilities that would require all of their strength to navigate. Carmen Rodriguez Chen had always been methodical in her approach to problem-solving, a trait that had served her well in both her accounting practice and her personal life. But the discovery of Tommy's letters had unleashed something in her that she hadn't felt since childhood: the desperate need to take action regardless of the consequences. For 30 years, she'd watched her parents suffer in silence, accepting the police department's gradual abandonment of the case and the community's shift from active concern to passive sympathy. Now, armed with concrete evidence that her brother had been planning a future rather than fleeing from one, Carmen found herself unable to simply wait for Detective Santos to work through official channels. 3 days after the detective's visit, Carmen sat in her home office at 10 o'clock at night, surrounded by printouts, notebooks, and her laptop displaying multiple browser tabs related to military enlistment procedures from the 1980s. Her husband, David, had gone to bed an hour earlier, and their daughters were presumably asleep, though she suspected Sophia might be awake, reading under her covers as teenagers often did. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of her computer and the occasional sound of pages turning as she worked through documents she'd requested from various sources. Her first breakthrough had come from an unexpected direction. While researching military recruitment practices from 1985, Carmen had discovered that enlistment records from that era were often more detailed than she'd initially assumed. The paperwork Tommy had hidden in the school desk included references, to his recruiter, Sergeant Robert Mitchell, and the specific recruitment station where he'd processed his enlistment. A quick internet search had revealed that Sergeant Mitchell was still alive, now retired and living in Arizona, and that several online military forums maintained databases of recruitment personnel from various time periods. Carmen had spent the better part of Tuesday afternoon crafting a careful email to Sergeant Mitchell, explaining her identity and the recent discovery of her brother's enlistment documents. She'd attached photocopies of the relevant paperwork and asked if he remembered Tommy or had any insight into what might have happened when her brother failed to report for basic training. The response had arrived within hours, and its contents had both thrilled and terrified her. Sergeant Mitchell not only remembered Tommy Rodriguez, but had been deeply concerned when the young man failed to appear at the military entrance processing station on his scheduled report date. According to his email, Tommy had been one of the most impressive recruits he'd worked with that year, scoring exceptionally high on the ASVAB and demonstrating the kind of maturity and motivation that made for successful military careers. Mitchell had personally driven to the Rodriguez family home on November 5, 1985, to check on Tommy's whereabouts, but had found the house apparently empty and had been unable to make contact with the family. What shocked Carmen most was Mitchell's revelation that he had continued to inquire about Tommy's disappearance for several months after the failed report date. He'd contacted local police, spoken with school officials, and even hired a private investigator to look into the situation. But the investigation had been hampered by the fact that Tommy's enlistment was confidential military information that couldn't be shared with civilian authorities without proper authorization. And the Rodriguez family's missing person report had focused on Tommy as a potential kidnapping or runaway victim, rather than as a military recruit who had failed to report for duty. Armed with this new information, Carmen had begun to piece together a timeline that revealed gaps and missed connections in the original investigation. The police had been looking for a missing teenager, while the military had been looking for a recruit who had changed his mind about enlisting. Neither agency had known about the other's interest in Tommy Rodriguez, and crucial information had never been shared between them. Carmen's second discovery had come from her research into Jefferson High School's records from 1985. Using her professional skills for obtaining financial documents, she'd requested personnel records and after-hours access logs from the school district, claiming she needed them for an insurance investigation related to her family's ongoing civil case. The records revealed something that Detective Santos's initial inquiry had missed. On October 15, 1985, the day Tommy disappeared, the school's custodial staff had logged an unusual entry in their daily reports. According to the custodian's notes, which Carmen had found buried in administrative files that had been digitized but never properly organized, someone had been observed in the building after normal hours on October 15th. The custodian, a man named Frank Kowalski who had worked at Jefferson High for over 20 years, had noted that he'd seen lights on in room 237, Margaret Walsh's current classroom, around 7:30 that evening. When he'd investigated, he'd found the room empty but had noticed that one of the desks appeared to have been disturbed, with drawers partially open and papers scattered on the floor. The significance of this discovery wasn't lost on Carmen. If Tommy had returned to school that evening to retrieve his letters or to add something to his hidden stash of documents, it would explain how the papers had ended up in Margaret Walsh's desk. But it also raised troubling questions about what might have happened to Tommy during or after his visit to the school that night. Carmen's investigation had taken on an urgency that she couldn't entirely explain to herself. Part of it was the thrill of finally having concrete leads to follow after 30 years of unanswered questions. But a larger part was her growing realization that Tommy's disappearance might not have been the random tragedy she'd always believed it to be. The careful timing of his enlistment, the secret nature of his planning, and the evidence that he'd returned to school after hours all suggested that someone might have known about Tommy's activities and had reasons for preventing him from carrying out his plans. Her third breakthrough came from an unexpected source, her own daughter Sophia. While Carmen had been focused on official records and military documentation, Sophia had taken a different approach, using social media and online genealogy sites to track down former Jefferson High School students and faculty from 1985. Her teenage facility with digital platforms had allowed her to locate and contact dozens of people who had been at the school during Tommy's senior year, many of whom were now approaching 50 and scattered across the country but still connected through various online networks. Sophia's outreach had yielded a response that made Carmen's blood run cold. A former student named Marcus Williams, who had been in Tommy's chemistry class, had replied to Sophia's inquiry with information that had never been reported to police. According to Marcus, Tommy had confided in him about his military plans approximately 1 week before his disappearance. But Tommy had also mentioned that someone else knew about his enlistment and had been pressuring him to reconsider his decision. Marcus's message, which Sophia had forwarded to her mother immediately upon receiving it, contained details that suggested Tommy's disappearance might have been connected to his military plans in ways no one had previously considered. Tommy had told Marcus that a school staff member had discovered his enlistment paperwork and had been trying to convince him that joining the military would be a mistake for someone with his academic potential. The staff member had allegedly offered to help Tommy find alternative solutions to his family's financial problems, including possible scholarship opportunities and part-time employment that would allow him to remain in school. The identity of this staff member remained unclear in Marcus's recollection, but he remembered Tommy being conflicted about the offer and uncertain about whether the person could be trusted. Tommy had apparently planned to meet with this individual on the afternoon of October 15th to discuss the proposed alternatives to military service. Marcus had assumed that Tommy had simply changed his mind about enlisting and had never thought to mention the conversation to investigators, particularly since no one had ever asked him about Tommy's military plans. Carmen stared at Marcus Williams's message on her computer screen, her mind racing with implications. If Tommy had met with a school staff member on the day he disappeared, and if that meeting had been related to his military enlistment, then his disappearance might not have been a random event. Someone at Jefferson High School might have had knowledge of Tommy's plans and motivation to prevent him from carrying them out. The possibilities that emerged from this line of thinking were both exciting and terrifying. On one hand, it suggested that Tommy's disappearance might be solvable if they could identify the staff member he'd planned to meet. On the other hand, it raised the specter that someone they had trusted, someone in a position of authority at Tommy's school, might have been involved in whatever had happened to him. Carmen reached for her phone to call Detective Santos, then hesitated. She knew the detective would want to follow proper procedures, obtain warrants, conduct official interviews, and work through established channels. All of that would take time, and Carmen was increasingly convinced that time was critical. If someone at Jefferson High School had been involved in Tommy's disappearance, and if that person was still alive and still in the community, then approaching the investigation too cautiously might give them opportunity to destroy evidence or fabricate explanations. Instead, Carmen made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She would drive to Jefferson High School the next morning and speak with Margaret Walsh directly. The retired teacher might remember details about other staff members from 1985, might have insights into who could have known about Tommy's use of room 237 as a hiding place, and might be willing to share information informally that could guide the official investigation in the right direction. Carmen also decided to call Marcus Williams directly, rather than waiting for Detective Santos to interview him through official channels. Marcus was now a successful engineer living in Seattle, according to his social media profiles, and he had volunteered his phone number in his message to Sophia. A direct conversation might yield additional details that he hadn't included in his initial response, particularly if Carmen could ask specific questions about Tommy's state of mind and the identity of the mysterious staff member. As Carmen prepared for bed, her mind was already working through the logistics of her unofficial investigation. She would need to take time off from work, arrange for David to handle the girls' transportation to their various activities, and prepare explanations for why she was suddenly devoting so much energy to a case that had been dormant for 3 decades. More importantly, she would need to decide how much to tell her parents about what she was discovering. Elena and Hector were still processing the emotional impact of learning about Tommy's military enlistment. Adding speculation about possible foul play involving school personnel might be more than they could handle, particularly if Carmen's investigation led nowhere or uncovered information that was even more painful than the original mystery. But Carmen also knew that her parents deserved to know if there was a possibility that Tommy's disappearance had been preventable, that someone in a position of trust had failed him when he needed help most. The decision to pursue her own investigation felt both reckless and necessary. For 30 years, Carmen had been the responsible daughter, the one who took care of her parents and built a stable life while carrying the weight of her family's tragedy. Now, for the first time since childhood, she was choosing action over patience, risk over safety, hope over resignation. As she finally turned off her computer and headed upstairs to bed, Carmen realized that she was no longer investigating Tommy's disappearance simply to find answers. She was investigating it to reclaim agency in a story that had controlled her family's life for 3 decades. Whether her efforts led to resolution or disappointment, she would finally be doing something active rather than simply enduring the passive ache of not knowing. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of either solving her brother's disappearance or learning definitively that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Either outcome seemed preferable to the limbo of uncertainty that had defined her family's existence for as long as she could remember. Margaret Walsh welcomed Carmen into her modest ranch-style home with the same warmth she had shown to thousands of students over her 4 decades of teaching. The living room was filled with the comfortable clutter of a long career in education. Bookshelves lined every wall, framed photographs of graduating classes covered the mantelpiece, and stacks of novels waited to be read in her retirement. Margaret had agreed to meet with Carmen immediately upon receiving her phone call, understanding intuitively that this conversation couldn't wait for official channels or formal appointments. "I've been thinking about your brother constantly since we found those letters," Margaret said as she served coffee in delicate china cups that had belonged to her mother. "I keep wondering how many times I walked past that desk over the years, never knowing that such important documents were hidden just inches away from where I worked every day." Carmen accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands trembling slightly from a combination of caffeine and nervous energy. She had spent the drive to Margaret's house rehearsing what she wanted to say, but now that she was here, the words seemed inadequate to convey the urgency she felt. "Mrs. Walsh, I think someone at Jefferson High School knew about Tommy's military plans, and I think that person might have been involved in his disappearance." Margaret's expression grew serious as Carmen explained about Marcus Williams's message and the custodian's report of unusual activity in room 237 on the night Tommy vanished. As the retired teacher listened, her face reflected a growing concern that suggested Carmen's suspicions might not be unfounded. "There was something strange about the weeks before Tommy disappeared," Margaret admitted slowly. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back now, with what we know about his enlistment, some things make more sense." She paused to sip her coffee, gathering her thoughts before continuing. Tommy had been staying after school frequently in September and early October, usually in the library or in empty classrooms. I assumed he was working on college applications or studying for his SATs, but now I wonder if he was meeting with his recruiter or preparing his enlistment paperwork. Carmen leaned forward eagerly. "Did you notice him talking to any particular staff members during that time? Anyone who seemed to be taking a special interest in his plans?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face creased with the effort of recalling events from 30 years ago. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of reluctance, as if she were sharing information that might be disloyal to a former colleague. "There was one person who mentioned Tommy to me several times during those weeks. Harold Brennan, the guidance counselor. He seemed very concerned about Tommy's future, kept asking me about his academic performance and whether I thought he was making good decisions about his post-graduation plans. The name Harold Brennan sent a chill through Carmen's body. She remembered Mr. Brennan from her own time at Jefferson High School, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had seemed genuinely interested in helping students navigate their futures. But she also remembered that he had been particularly focused on students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, often pushing them toward immediate college enrollment, rather than alternative paths that might better serve their circumstances. What kind of questions was he asking about Tommy? Carmen pressed, her investigative instincts fully activated now. Margaret set down her coffee cup with a slight tremor in her hands. He wanted to know if I thought Tommy was being pressured by his family to make certain choices, if I had noticed any changes in his behavior or academic performance. He also asked if I knew whether Tommy was considering military service, which seemed like an odd question at the time since most students who were interested in the military were quite open about it. Carmen felt her pulse quicken. Did Mr. Brennan ever mention meeting with Tommy directly? He said he had called Tommy into his office several times to discuss college applications and scholarship opportunities. Harold was always very proud of his success in getting first-generation college students into good schools, often with significant financial aid packages. He saw it as his mission to make sure capable students didn't miss opportunities because of their family's economic circumstances. The picture that was emerging from Margaret's recollections was both illuminating and deeply troubling. Harold Brennan had apparently known or suspected that Tommy was considering military service, had been actively working to dissuade him from that path, and had been monitoring his activities and academic performance in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Carmen pulled out her phone and showed Margaret the message from Marcus Williams. As Margaret read about Tommy's mention of a staff member who had discovered his enlistment plans and offered alternative solutions, her face grew pale. "Oh my goodness," Margaret whispered. "That sounds exactly like something Harold would do." He was absolutely opposed to military recruitment at the high school level, always arguing that it preyed on economically disadvantaged students who had other options if they just received proper guidance. "Is Mr. Brennan still alive?" Carmen asked, though she dreaded the answer. Margaret nodded slowly. "He retired about 10 years ago, but he still lives in Millbrook. He's in his 80s now, but his mind is still sharp." "Carmen, if you're thinking of confronting him about this, you need to be very careful. If Harold was involved in Tommy's disappearance, he's had 30 years to construct whatever story he wants to tell." Carmen stood up abruptly, her mind racing, with the implications of what she'd learned. Harold Brennan had motive, opportunity, and knowledge of Tommy's plans. If he had convinced Tommy to meet with him on October 15th to discuss alternatives to military service, and if that meeting had gone wrong somehow, it could explain everything about her brother's disappearance. "I need to call Detective Santos," Carmen said, reaching for her phone. But Margaret caught her arm gently. "Carmen, there's something else you should know before you involve the police," Margaret said, her voice heavy with a burden she'd apparently been carrying for years. Harold Brennan wasn't just opposed to military recruitment in principle. His own son was killed in Vietnam in 1973, just a few months before the war ended. He blamed the military recruiters who had convinced his boy to enlist, and he'd made it his personal mission to prevent other families from experiencing that kind of loss. This revelation added a psychological dimension to Harold Brennan's possible involvement that made Carmen's heart race with both fear and understanding. A man who had lost his own son to military service might have been capable of extreme actions to prevent another young man from making what he saw as the same fatal mistake. Carmen called Detective Santos immediately, explaining what she'd learned from Margaret Walsh and requesting an immediate meeting. The detective agreed to meet them at the police station within the hour, recognizing that the information Carmen had gathered might finally provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 3 decades. At the police station, Detective Santos listened intently as Carmen and Margaret recounted their conversation and the connections they'd identified between Harold Brennan and Tommy's disappearance. The detective took careful notes, asked clarifying questions, and gradually built a timeline that showed how Brennan's knowledge of Tommy's military plans could have led to a confrontation on October 15, 1985. "We'll need to approach this very carefully," Detective Santos warned. "If Mr. Brennan was involved in Tommy's disappearance, he's an elderly man now who might not be competent to stand trial. But more importantly, if he's been living with this secret for 30 years, confronting him directly might cause him to destroy evidence or harm himself before we can learn what really happened to Tommy." The detective's plan was methodical and thorough. They would first obtain warrants to search Harold Brennan's home and any storage units or properties he might own. They would interview other staff members from Jefferson High School who might remember interactions between Brennan and Tommy. They would examine Brennan's personal records from 1985, including his calendar, phone records, and any personal correspondence that might shed light on his activities during the crucial time period. 2 days later, the search warrant was executed at Harold Brennan's modest home on Pine Street, just 6 blocks from Jefferson High School. What they found in his basement study validated every suspicion Carmen had developed. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet were detailed notes about Tommy Rodriguez, including copies of his academic records, scholarship applications that Brennan had prepared without Tommy's knowledge, and most damning of all, a handwritten journal that documented Brennan's growing obsession with preventing Tommy's military enlistment. The journal entries from September and October 1985 painted a picture of a man whose grief over his own son's death had evolved into a dangerous fixation on saving other young men from what he saw as military exploitation. Brennan had convinced himself that Tommy was being manipulated by military recruiters who were taking advantage of his family's financial desperation, and he had developed an elaborate plan to provide Tommy with alternatives that would make military service unnecessary. But the final entry in the journal, dated October 15, 1985, revealed that Brennan's intervention had gone tragically wrong. Tommy had agreed to meet with him after school to discuss the scholarship opportunities, but when confronted with Brennan's knowledge of his secret enlistment, Tommy had become angry and defensive. According to Brennan's account, Tommy had insisted that his decision to join the military was his own choice, and that he didn't want Brennan's help or interference. The confrontation had escalated when Brennan threatened to contact Tommy's parents and reveal his enlistment plans before he could explain them himself. Tommy had apparently tried to leave, and in the struggle that followed, he had fallen and struck his head on the corner of Brennan's desk. Brennan's journal entry described his panic as he realized Tommy wasn't breathing, his desperate attempts at CPR, and his ultimate decision to conceal what had happened rather than face the consequences of his actions. The journal ended with Brennan's account of burying Tommy's body in a remote section of Millbrook Cemetery, using his access as a volunteer groundskeeper to dig a grave in an unmarked area where bodies were unlikely to be discovered. He had disposed of Tommy's bicycle by disassembling it and throwing the parts into Miller Creek, and he had spent the following weeks carefully constructing an alibi and maintaining the appearance of concern for the missing student. The discovery of Brennan's journal led police to the exact location in Millbrook Cemetery where Tommy's remains were found, finally giving the Rodriguez family the closure they had sought for 30 years. Harold Brennan, now 83 and suffering from the early stages of dementia, was arrested but deemed incompetent to stand trial. He died peacefully in a care facility 6 months later, taking with him the final details of Tommy's last moments. Tommy Rodriguez was laid to rest with full military honors, his family finally understanding that his disappearance had not been abandonment, but the tragic result of one man's misguided attempt to save him from a fate that Tommy had chosen freely. The Rodriguez family established a scholarship fund in Tommy's memory, helping other first-generation college students pursue their dreams, whether those dreams led to higher education, military service, or other paths to success. Carmen found, peace in knowing that her brother had loved his family enough to sacrifice his own desires for their welfare, and that his disappearance had been the result of someone else's actions rather than any failure on the part of the family. Elena and Hector were finally able to grieve properly, no longer haunted by questions about whether they had somehow driven their son away. The story of Tommy Rodriguez's disappearance and the 30-year journey to discover the truth became a testament to the power of family love, the importance of never giving up hope, and the way that seemingly ordinary people can become heroes through their dedication to finding answers. Margaret Walsh returned to volunteer teaching, using Tommy's story to help other students understand the importance of communication with their families about major life decisions. If this story has moved you, if you believe in the power of never giving up on the people we love, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of families who refuse to accept that their loved ones were gone forever. Sometimes the truth takes decades to emerge, but love and determination can overcome even the most impossible odds.